So I'm holding a nitty and at the risk of sounding like I'm actually intelligent, I do have a guest here today that is going to tell us what this is, what's done with it, amongst a whole array of other things. So Kathy's in my dream of the woodland escape becoming a hub of craftspeople, historians, researchers, is actually coming to fruition. So over the past year, we've had numerous talented artisans, and I'd like to introduce Barb Whelan to everyone. And Barb is, she's going to be a bit modest here, but she's a walking encyclopedia of fabrics. And along with that has a few skills that very few people in North America are still practicing, and we're going to get into that. But so I don't have a clue what that is. What is a nitty noddy?
May I?
Yeah, you're going to demonstrate.
So this is a nitty noddy, you're quite right. And this would have been used, and is still used actually, it's not just historical, but it's used once you have spun your yarn into a continuous thread, and either used it singly or plied it into 2 or 3 or however many plies that makes sense to you, that in order to finish it, you've got to make it into a skein.
Okay.
And so the yarn is wound around, you can see that these are at right angles to each other.
Posing, yeah.
And so the yarn is wound around and up and around, and so for the length of your yarn, and then each length of yarn or each tower in each corner is then tied. You can take it off the nitty noddy, and then you have a skein, and at that point you can then either wash it, wet finish it, or you could dye it, and that after it's finished, your skein is as complete as you want it, then you can turn it into a ball to use it for knitting or for weaving.
Great. So the device, can I have the nitty noddy back?
Of course.
Well, I always wanted one of these. I can think of other applications actually. So the device you're using would be something that if someone on the frontier didn't have a spinning wheel, is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
And so that's how you're actually spinning the fiber into yarn.
Yes.
And how does that work?
So you can see that this is a very simple tool. It's basically a dowel with a whirl. And spindles, drop spindles, that's what this is, come in 2 different styles. This is called a bottom whirl because the whirl is at the bottom.
Okay.
You can also have top whirls, in which case the whirl would be at the top. I understand that in this part of the country, bottom whirls were more common because it's less dependent on the woodworker being exactly accurate.
Okay.
So you could get a more even spin with somebody who's not technically expert at making the whirl if you put the whirl on the bottom. And so I've got my wool roving.
That's crazy.
And it's called a drop spindle because that often
that's-
happens. And then when I have my length, I wind it into this cop at the bottom.
The cop?
The cop at the bottom. That's what it's called. And then I hook it around my hook at the top. Now this hook happens to be metal, but it wouldn't have to be metal. And this works because wool is basically, it's like little Velcro. And when you spin it, it sticks to itself. And so what starts out as being this fluffy, airy roving then becomes yarn. And then I can use it to make cloth.
So, if I may, so this fiber here, so you've done this once, then assuming you don't have a spinning wheel, then you're going to take 2 or 3 strands of this and do it again until you get the thickness of the yarn you want for the project.
That's exactly right. And depending on the weight of your spindle, you can make your initial plied or your initial 1-ply yarn thicker or thinner depending on what the ultimate use is going to be. So what I tend to do is I wind it off my spindle into a ball, and then when I've got 2 or 3 balls, then I ply it again into my skein, into my 3-ply yarn, and then I can wind it onto a skein.
Yeah.
Of course.
That's fascinating. So we're going to, am I going to wreck something here?
Not at all.
You can fix up my mess. Okay, so there's the first of many things that Barb's going to show us and demonstrate today. The one that fascinates me the most, we talked about different types of weaving, but you do an art that is almost lost. There are only a handful of you actually doing it now, and it's called
Sprang.
Sprang. So I'm going to grab a piece, and you brought a beautiful example, and we can talk a bit about that?
Sure.
Perfect. I don't know, Barb, if I spent the rest of my natural life, mind you, I'm old, but even if I started in my youth, I don't think I'd ever master that. That is mind-boggling, the intricacy of that. So maybe we could start. You talked briefly before when we were chatting about the history of it and how far back Sprang dates.
There's evidence of Sprang as a textile dating back at least 4,000 years. And it comes from the imprints on the bottom of clay bottles, and it comes from Coptic bonnets, as in mummy bonnets.
Okay.
So we know that people have been doing Sprang for a long time.
Now we fast forward a few thousand years, and it becomes a very common item worn as a sash for the higher command, if you would. So we think, and we talked again earlier, but you were mentioning it sort of falls out of favor around or shortly after the American Civil War. But up until then, like if we think about all the generals, Lee and Grant, they were wearing a sash like this. British officers in 1812, George Washington in the American Revolution, were all wearing a Sprang sash.
Absolutely. And also, I didn't mention this to you earlier, but in the towns in Europe, the city officials would have Sprang sashes.
Okay, cool. That's so cool. So what are we looking at in terms of time to make this sash? This would go around me twice, I'm thinking. If you want to leave that when you go, that would be okay too, Barb.
This will take me many months to recreate. I budget myself 4 rows a day because every stitch on every row has to be finger manipulated. And it's not technically a woven structure at all because there's no weft except at the very end. So many people would say it's actually a braid.
Okay.
So I'm braiding, in this case, 160 threads many times.
Ah, that's mind-boggling. So you're not going to demonstrate how this is done today, but for those that want to see how intricate a process this is, there's an organization called the Historian Symposium.
History Symposium.
History Symposium. So if you go to that, we'll put a link below where you can actually see Barb doing her work and finishing a sash for the Brigadier General, right, for the umbrella of the 1812 group in Ontario.
That's right.
But also, you mentioned in the sash that you're going to show in that, and I encourage anybody to go to it. He's the 41st
Yes.
Regiment of Foot. We're a Welsh regiment.
Yes.
So you embellished it. It's not just a weave. What else did you do in this sash?
So many of the sashes, including the one that George Washington ultimately wore, in addition to being made of Sprang, have included Sprang lace, so you can include motifs. And so the Brigadier General's has a Welsh dragon, and the leeks that are part of the ritual of the 41st Regiment.
Yeah,
Yes.
and you had the 41st on there as well.
41st.
I would love to. I'm going to have a look at that myself. Yeah, that's amazing. And it is all made of silk.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So, I know what we were going to talk about. We were going to compare this to finger weaving. So this was gifted to me by my good friend Denis Caron from Quebec, and he's a master finger weaver. It's the Assumption pattern. It's sort of out of my persona. So we're talking Métis, early 1800s in that time period. But now that we're coming up to the festive season, I'm going to wear this because I think it'll embellish my outfit a wee bit. But can you maybe explain the difference between this and Sprang?
Sure, I'd love to. Finger weaving and Sprang are quite similar, actually. Now, a sash like this could be made in 2 ways. You could start at one end and finger weave all the way up. to the other end, or you could start in the middle and weave it from each end. Either way you do that, at the end of your threads, as you change the position of threads with respect to each other, you end up with tangles at the bottom.
Big mess.
And at each row, you've got to untangle them. Sprang capitalizes on that because it secures the threads at the bottom so that when a weave is made at one end, instead of weaving,
Tangling up.
detangling so you have a clean exit here, you end up recreating the weave where it's actually secured.
So you're doing it both. When you're weaving up here, you're replicating it down there?
The hallmark of Sprang is the center line.
Okay. Helps those generals figure out how to put it on, too.
That's right, this is the center.
I'm thinking.
So if you see the center line in a sash, that's what makes it Sprang.
Okay.
That's the first row that I would have woven.
Fascinating. Fascinating. I like mechanical things, and I don't have a clue what you're going to do with this, but it's called an umbrella swift.
An umbrella swift.
How I got it right. But I'm thinking they forgot to put the skin over it. There's no, that ain't going to keep out a lot of rain. So, what do we have here? Oh, hang on. I think this goes up like the collar.
Exactly. You
Okay.
got it.
Wow, I figured that out. So what do we do with an umbrella swift?
So, for example, this is a skein of yarn.
Looks hand-dyed.
It's hand-dyed. So this would then be, this knob would be lowered to be the circumference that I want, and this would be, let's see if I can actually do this,
Here, I'll...
in situ.
Fascinating.
There.
Okay. Now what do you
So
do?
now I have a skein of yarn, and then from this I can do whatever I want. It's much more manipulable, so I can put it into a ball if I want to knit with it. I can weave with it, but it's once it's on the swift, that's how the easiest way to then get it into the form that I ultimately want to use it.
Perfect. Anyway, what else we got? Moving right along.
So I've kind of organized this oldest to newest. So this is linen. This is a linen strick. So this is actually a fairly processed form of linen. So it's already been grown and harvested and retted.
You know, and I'm wearing the shirt as the end product. Somewhere down in there is a linen, coarse linen shirt. Mm-hmm. So something we want to do here at the Woodland Escape is actually plant 1/4 of an acre of flax and see if we
And
can
invite me.
build breaks and do all the accoutrements required and go from there to there.
So this is linen that has been spun into linen yarn. And this is a fairly thick grist of linen.
Mm-hmm.
The linen that was woven with 200 years ago often was much finer than that, but it's virtually impossible to even find linen that's as fine as what they spun 200 years ago.
Unless you make it yourself.
Unless you make it yourself.
We'll try that.
I've got a couple of examples of linen. So this is unbleached linen that was made with yarn much like this.
And that's a tea towel.
That's a tea towel.
I'm going to talk about the functional parts of these things. So, well, so when you say when you're creating these are yours. These aren't a bought-in item. So you obviously have a loom at home.
Yes, several.
Several looms. So
Yes.
and this is hand loomed on this machine, right, I'm assuming. And then we get into things that boggle my mind, but this seems to have a pattern in it different than this.
This is actually a traditional overshot pattern. Now, most commonly, people will think of overshot as they see in coverlets. So it would be a white background with often an indigo blue pattern in it. This actually is white on white, but it is a traditional pattern that I was able to reproduce in this tea towel.
So when you say different looms, so you got them for different sizes. Like you have a loom that's for that width of material,
Yes.
and then you have bigger ones. We're going to get into blankets in a minute, but for
I do.
blankets that are much bigger, right? Mm-hmm. Okay.
So this, I have a table loom that's 15 inches wide, so anything smaller than 15 inches wide I could make on my table loom.
Okay.
So I'm just going to move the linen aside. And I've just got a couple samples of hand-dyed yarn here. So this that's on the umbrella swift is onion skins.
Perfect. Beautiful color.
Onion skins are beautiful.
And the mauve.
This is logwood.
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 Wow.
This is indigo, which many people will recognize. This is black walnut.
We just did some of that last week.
And this is madder.
Madder root.
Madder root. And in fact, madder root, often people think of madder as being red, but often it'll come out into a rusty orange color.
All beautiful. And then we get into some more, am I getting onto the timeline here? Or we're still in it? But we're talking about looming. So this one has a pattern in it.
These are examples of what would have been possible for weavers very early in North America.
Okay.
So these are examples of what people think of as Acadian weaving, because they can be done on a 2-harness loom. But you can see that the embellishments make it really interesting, and I'll talk about this one, for instance. So this is a plain weave background for people who know weaving, and it's all plain weave, but I've just inserted 4 ends of the yarn in a heddle rather than just the one, so you end up with this grid to just give it a little more interest.
Character. So when you say Acadian, were they the ones that came up with this concept of patterns, for example? Is that where its roots are, its origins?
Many people have come up with embellishments, so the Acadians are one example of that. But it's, to me, that's the creativity when you have such a simple loom that you can do so many different embellishments to have a very
look at this.
different.
And then different patterns of stripes even. That is beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
And these were made by inserting a stick, and then you just end up with a loop of yarn to have these little boutons.
Nubbins?
Nubbins.
Boutons. Boutons, you say. And this one's an interesting pattern here. Wow. They did like their color.
Yes.
We tend to think of our ancestors as these boring, drably dressed people. I mean, look at your dress and the color of my frock coat and patterns like that. They appreciated color as much as we do today, I'm sure. So that gets us into blankets.
Yes.
And we have some homemade blankets. You know, I have to say at the onset, we think of historically, so much is written about men, right? The battles,
Indeed.
the military. I know, my apologies. But I think about the unsung heroes of the frontier. Where would the men be without the women? I mean, we think about the work involved, and it was the women essentially that were planting the flax, making the linen, weaving it, and then sewing it. And then we got to wear it and go hunting and such, go shoot people on the battlefield. So anyway, definitely the unsung heroes. So we were at blankets, right?
However, traditionally, weaving was done by men.
Was it?
It was.
I learn every time someone comes here.
But when families came to colonial North America, the men, they needed the heavy brawn of the men to do all the outdoor stuff, so women took up the weaving. Women had traditionally done the spinning to create the yarn, but weaving was often done professionally
Interesting.
by men.
By men. Yeah, it's interesting.
So what I've got here, this is a blanket that I made, and I call it a civilian blanket because it's not typical of anything military. But you can see that it has a seam, maybe you can see here, because I made this on my 45-inch floor loom,
Right.
but I had to make 2 widths of it and sew it up the center.
So it's 88 inches wide.
Well, once it was woven 88 inches wide. However, even before I've taken it off the loom, I've probably lost 10% of the width. And then I'm going to wet finish it, and then I'm going to full it. So it's nowhere near 88 inches wide now. But so it's probably maybe 72 inches wide at this point.
It's like a 3.5 point blanket.
So, but if you look at historically blankets, they all have a center seam unless they were done professionally.
Right.
And I've dyed this. You can see I've used the indigo hand-dyed yarn and my madder dyed yarn to make these
Absolutely beautiful.
fancy stripes.
And so what is the last step? People talk about the felting or the fulling. And how is that done?
Traditionally in Scotland, that's where you get your walking songs. And so you would have a circle of people around a table, often it's women, and they would have this wet blanket.
Like soaking wet?
Soaking wet.
Okay.
And it goes from hand to hand to hand to hand to hand around the table because they don't have anything like a top-loading washing machine to do the agitation. It's all done by hand.
Okay.
So.
And what effects that having on the wool, on the weave?
When you take it off the loom, it looks like burlap.
Okay.
And the fulling process
tightens the weave.
tightens it, felts it. So you end up with a much thicker, denser fabric.
Would you be singing me a walking song now?
A walking song.
Classic.
Have to learn a walking song.
That is absolutely beautiful. Okay, so we're moving along here. We have another blanket.
This blanket comes from my historical family. So this blanket came with a note that was dated 1939, and the note says this blanket is about 100 years old.
Wow.
And as I understand it, this blanket, back to your last question, you can see more of the weave structure. It's more burlappy because it's not been fulled as much.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Thinner.
But as I understand it, this blanket was woven in rural New Brunswick, was sent to Colorado with the weaver's daughter because she was going to aid people who were going to help in the logging mills in early Colorado. It moved to New Mexico and stayed there for many generations and found its way back to my family about 20 years ago.
That is absolutely fascinating.
And it's typical. I think this is known as a window pane pattern for obvious reasons, but you can see too that it has the center seam, so you know it was made
Oh yeah,
on a
look
loom
at that.
similar to my 45
to yours.
Yes.
I'll tell you, no logger slept in that. That's in too good a shape for a logger to have used it. Known a few in my life. Okay, now we're down to this guy.
So this is a shawl that I wove, and it's similar, it's not exact, because it's about half the width of a shawl that's actually in the collection of the Royal Ontario Museum. The one that's there is a man's shawl, and it's twice the width of this. I didn't want one that heavy, so I just made it half as wide. But I used the same, I was able to deduce the pattern just by looking at the picture and recreate this shawl. And the colors I chose because they would be similar to the indigo dyed that they would have had at that point. So it's natural white and then the indigo dyed blue.
Right, it's beautiful. So I'm curious, how many hours? I mean, that's not even a blanket. That's not even a half a blanket. But how many hours to do that on your loom?
Not so many, because it's wool. Takes much less time than this because there are fewer threads.
Right.
So to set up the process, to set up my loom, I have to wind the warp, and then I have to put the warp onto my loom, and then I have to thread the heddles, every thread, and this probably has 10 threads per inch, whereas this has, the white one I showed you earlier has 30 threads per inch.
Okay.
So for something that's 45 inches wide, this now only has 450 threads, where something like that might have 450 threads to get something this wide.
That wide, yeah.
Then to weave it, if I wove full time, I could probably weave it in a day, but I probably wouldn't because my body would hurt after.
Must seem awfully fast compared to Sprang. I'm just saying, what did you say? 4 rows a day is your limit?
Indeed, it does. Yes, a Sprang sash, I budget 3 to 6 months.
Barb's put me to good use. I'm a tree, she said. Just pretend you're a tree. Keep tension on that. Don't move. I like this machine versus the umbrella Swift because it has less moving parts. But maybe you could tell us, Barb, what it is and what you're doing.
This is a traditional paddle loom. Now it's not 200 years old, it's actually quite modern, but it's made in the same style as a traditional paddle loom. And its purpose is to create narrow bands, which were so important 200 years ago, whether this one has color in it, but a band might have been used for embellishment on a gown, certainly. But you'd also need bands for things like seed bags. And anything that needs a narrow band or tape, they were also called. Strong cord, would be made with something like this. The other purpose, though, was to show one's sweetheart how much they meant to you. And oftentimes you'll see historic ones, because they'll be mounted on a wall with beautiful carvings up here, and they would be presented as a betrothal gift.
Wow. Because
it was such an important part of a pioneer household to have a tape loom or a band loom or a paddle
very common
loom.
in every house.
Maybe not every, but certainly many.
Yes, interesting. You know what I find interesting? There's an old saying that the crafts of today are the artifacts of tomorrow, and I absolutely love that. But what I appreciate from yourself and many others who have visited us is the fact that there are a handful of people out there that are keeping these old skills alive.
Yes, and I think it's so important. I participated in a number of educational days, and just to expose, well, not just children, but our population to where we've come from, how our clothes came to be, things that we take for granted, but were not always as easy to come by as they are.
How we got from there to here.
Mm-hmm.
So we got a wee bit of a storm happening out there, Barb. Would you be thinking of spending the night?
Well, that's very generous of you. Thank you. It's a long trek home. So
It is. We have an extra straw tick up in the loft.
Lovely.
You can have right in front of the fire tonight.
Lovely.
And supper. You were mentioning there's a food you don't like.
Nutmeg.
Nutmeg. You know the funny part is neither do I. And the irony is it was probably one of the most common foods used to supplement their diet in the 1700s. I don't get it, but then again, how's my tension?
It's perfect. You're much more accommodating than my typical poster tree that I find.
Good
So,
tree.
so it's great. You may have a job.
Feel like a mighty oak here.